A young black man shopping at a store is accused of theft by a clerk who claims to have seen a man wearing similar clothes and of the same skin color taking a phone without paying. With tension in the air, the police are called. Edward was a young black man, known for the responsibility and honesty he carried since an early age, values instilled by his parents, hard-working individuals who always taught him to respect others and pursue his goals with integrity. He held a modest job where he worked with seriousness and dedication, nurturing the desire to one day provide a more comfortable life for his family. Quiet and reserved, he avoided conflicts and preferred to stay away from any trouble, being recognized in the community for his upright conduct and the respect with which he treated everyone around him. Edward woke up with the first rays of sunlight streaming through the window. Without thinking much, he reached for his phone, which he kept beside his bed every night. When he tried to turn it on, nothing happened. He pressed the power button several times, but the screen remained dark. "Oh no! Now?" he muttered, trying one last time to press the button, but with no success. The device was completely unresponsive. He sighed, already anticipating what might be the issue. That phone was old and had been showing signs of failure in recent months. Every time he charged it, the battery seemed to drain faster, and now it seemed to have finally stopped working. Still deep in thought, he left the room and went to the kitchen, where his parents were already starting their day. "Good morning, Mum." "Good morning, Dad," Edward greeted them, trying to hide his frustration. His mother, smiling, looked up as she served the coffee. "Good morning, son. What's with the face? Did something happen?" Edward showed her the phone, which was turned off. "I think it's really broken now, Mum. I tried turning it on, but nothing happens. It's been having problems, but now there's no signal at all." His dad, who was finishing his coffee, reached out his hand to take the phone. "Let me see it, Edward. Maybe it's something simple to fix." Edward handed him the phone, hopeful. His dad examined it from all angles, pressed the power button a few times, and remained silent for a few moments. After a while, he shook his head. "I think the battery isn't holding a charge, Edward," he said, handing the phone back. "It looks like it's completely gone." "Do you think it's hopeless, Dad?" Edward asked, worried. The idea of having to buy a new phone made him uncomfortable, especially since he knew how much it would cost. His dad thought for a moment and replied, "Buying a new battery is much cheaper than getting a whole new phone, son. I think you can find one in the city center, even though this phone is a bit old." "Do you really think so? If there's a way to fix it, that would be much better than buying a new phone," Edward said, feeling a bit relieved. "Of course," his dad encouraged. "Go to the city center. Check the electronics stores. I bet someone will have a battery for your model." Before Edward could respond, his mother placed a mug of coffee and a plate of fresh bread on the table. "But first, Edward, sit down and have breakfast with us. Then you can take care of the phone." He smiled and sat at the table. "You're right, Mom. I'll have my coffee first, thanks." Edward drank his coffee slowly and ate some bread while his parents talked about the day. When he finished, he got up. "Well, I'm going to take a shower and change before heading to the center," he said, leaving the kitchen. Edward returned to his room, grabbed some clean clothes and headed straight for the bathroom. After a quick shower, he put on a red short-sleeved shirt, a worn-out pair of jeans, and light brown sneakers. He took one last look at his reflection in the mirror and, satisfied, grabbed his wallet and left the room. Before leaving, he went to the kitchen again. "I'm heading out, Mom. Dad, I'm going to see if I can find the battery for my phone." "Good luck, Edward. Hope you find it soon," his dad said, while his mother blessed him with a small gesture. Edward walked to the bus stop near his house and waited a few minutes. He watched the cars go by while thinking about the day's task and wondering if he'd be lucky enough to find a battery for such an old phone. Finally, the bus arrived. and Edward boarded, giving the driver a discreet wave. Upon arriving at the city centre, he got off the bus and walked towards the first electronics store he saw. As soon as he entered, he was greeted by an attendant who was watching him with a professional smile. "Good morning," said the attendant. "Good morning," Edward replied. "Do you have a battery for this phone model here?" He showed the phone to the attendant. The attendant carefully examined the phone, adjusting his glasses to see better. "This model is a bit old, you know? I'm not sure we have one. Let me check the system." He fiddled with a tablet for a moment, then shook his head. "Unfortunately, we don't have it in stock, but maybe you'll find it in other stores. There are some that specialize in old parts." Edward nodded, disappointed but thankful for the help. "Thanks. I'll try another store." He continued walking around the center, entering several electronics stores and repeating the same question. In each store, the response was always similar. The phone was too old and the batteries were no longer available. In one of the stores, the attendant, an older and friendly man, seemed more interested in helping him. "This phone really is from the past," said the attendant, laughing. "But look, there's a new store that opened recently. They have a huge variety of parts. Maybe they'll have something for your model." "Really? Where is this store?" Edward asked, excited about the possibility. "Go 2 streets down and turn right. You can't miss it. The sign is huge." "You'll see it from a distance," explained the attendant, smiling. "Thanks for the tip," Edward said, hopeful. "I'll check it out." Following the directions, Edward walked through the streets of the center, observing the stores and the activity around him. After a few minutes, he saw the sign of the new store from afar, just as the attendant had said. It was a modern store with large windows and a sleek design. Edward entered the store and began exploring the shelves, admiring the numerous models of phones and accessories on display. The store was much more modern than the others he had visited, and he felt a little out of place there. He marveled at the variety of devices, from the simplest and cheapest to the more advanced models, with price tags that surprised him. "Who pays all that money for a phone?" he wondered, astonished. But the abundance of products also gave him hope that he would find the part he needed. With so many models and accessories, it's likely they have the battery I'm looking for. Edward began walking toward an attendant near the counter. Before he could call her, he was interrupted by a sharp scream coming from the back of the store. He quickly turned around and saw a young black man running toward him. The guy was wearing clothes almost identical to his, a red short-sleeve shirt and worn-out jeans. The only visible difference was a small symbol printed on the shirt of the stranger. The young man hurried past Edward and ran out of the store. In a matter of seconds, an attendant appeared running toward him, her face red with fury. She grabbed Edward's arm tightly. "Gotcha! You thought you could escape, huh, you little thief?" she shouted, squeezing his arm even harder. "Hey, what's going on? I didn't do anything," Edward said, trying to free his arm and looking around, confused and scared. "You must be confusing me with someone else." The attendant looked at him with disdain and brought her face closer. "Confusing you? I saw you running with the phone. You thought you were clever, huh?" she said, not letting go of him. "I didn't run with anything. I didn't move," Edward protested, trying to break free, but the attendant held on tightly. Other store employees came closer, with expressions of distrust and anger. One of them, a middle-aged man, looked Edward up and down with a cold expression. "That's it. Just another little thief thinking he's gonna get away with it," he muttered. Edward shook his head, not understanding what was happening. "I swear I didn't do anything. I just came to get a battery for my phone." "Oh, you're gonna pretend you don't know?" "Typical," the attendant replied sarcastically. "I saw you running with the phone, but I didn't do anything. You're making a mistake," Edward pleaded, already feeling the weight of the judgment in every gaze around him. Ignoring his words, the attendant began searching his pockets without permission. "Where is it? Where did you hide what you took?" "Hide what? I didn't take anything," he answered, feeling the humiliation grow with every second. Edward looked at another attendant approaching, hoping someone would listen to him, but the man just stared at him reproachfully. "Now you're pretending not to understand?" "Typical," the attendant fired, rolling her eyes. In a quick move, she turned to a colleague and shouted, "Call the cops! This one's not leaving until he explains where he hid what he took." I didn't do anything," Edward repeated, almost whispering, trying to get anyone, to hear him. However, the employees ignored him completely, murmuring insults, and remained firmly around him as if they were sure he was guilty. A few minutes later, Edward heard the sound of a siren approaching. He took a deep breath, trying to control his nervousness. Maybe the police's arrival would be the chance to clear up this misunderstanding. Two uniformed figures, a man and a woman, got out of the car and walked into the store with determined steps. "What's going on?" asked the female officer, looking directly at the attendant who was still holding Edward's arm. "We caught this one trying to steal a phone. I saw him running out of the back of the store, and we had to hold him before he could escape," said the attendant with a triumphant look, as if presenting a trophy. Edward opened his mouth to explain, but the officer interrupted him. "Stay quiet, young man. We'll sort this out." She gestured to the other officer, who approached Edward with a stern expression. "Put your hands behind your back," ordered the officer, while Edward complied, his heart racing. "But I didn't do anything. This is a mistake." Edward tried to argue, but the officer showed no sign of doubt. In a swift move, the officer pushed him to the ground, pressing his face against the floor as he handcuffed his wrists. "Ah, these little thieves. We get one of these to arrest every day," the officer muttered with a tone of contempt as he cuffed Edward. Meanwhile, the female officer was gathering information from the attendants, taking notes on her pad. Edward lay on the floor, feeling the coldness of the floor and the weight of the handcuffs, a sense of humiliation growing inside him. He looked around, seeing the hard, accusatory expressions of the employees and customers who watched the scene with interest. As the attendants continued to describe the supposed theft, the other officer looked up and noticed a security camera in the corner of the store. He turned to the attendant and asked, "Is this camera working? Can we check the footage?" The attendant, who had maintained a smug expression until then, hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Yes, of course. I'll get the tablet to access the footage." She quickly left and came back a few minutes later with the tablet, handing it to the officers. The female officer, holding the tablet, began reviewing the footage under the watchful eye of her partner. Edward, still handcuffed and lying on the floor, felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe now they would see that he hadn't done anything. After a few minutes of reviewing the footage, the female officer looked at her partner and shook her head. "It's not him. The clothes are similar, but you can see that the other guy has a symbol on his shirt that this one doesn't," she stated, with a tone of finality. The officer who had been with Edward sighed and removed the handcuffs from his wrists without any care or kindness. "You're free to go," he said coldly, without looking directly at Edward. The female officer approached and said, "Looks like it was a mistake. You were confused with the real suspect, who was wearing similar clothes. You can go, but try not to get involved in any more trouble." Edward slowly got up, rubbing his sore wrists, and looked at the police officers and attendants, hoping for some kind of apology or retraction. But everyone avoided looking at him, either looking away or acting as if the incident was something trivial. Seeing that he wouldn't receive any apology or recognition of error, Edward sighed, feeling a mixture of sadness and indignation. He gave one last look at the police officers and employees, and without saying anything else left the store. He walked in silence to the bus stop, reflecting on everything that had just happened, still in shock and unable to believe the humiliation he had endured. On the bus ride back home, Edward stared out the window, trying to process the sadness and injustice of the situation, unsure how to explain it to his parents. Edward arrived home slowly, feeling the weight of everything he had been through that day. He opened the door and found his parents sitting in the living room. Their gaze immediately fixed on his face, and they both knew something was deeply wrong. "Edward, what happened, son?" his mother asked, with visible concern on her face. He walked over slowly and sat on the sofa next to them. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Today, something horrible happened, Mom. Something I never thought would happen to me." Edward's dad leaned forward, attentive and anxious. "What happened, son? You can tell us." Edward began to recount everything, detailing every moment of what happened in the store, the false accusation, the unjust treatment by the attendants and police, the shock and humiliation he felt when being handcuffed and treated like a criminal. "I was just there to buy a battery for my phone," he said, his voice breaking. "And suddenly, this attendant grabbed me, called me a thief. I couldn't understand what was happening. My God!" his mother exclaimed, with her hand over her mouth. "How could they do that to you, without any proof, without anything?" Edward nodded, still incredulous. "That's what I can't accept. I didn't do anything wrong, and yet they treated me like I was a criminal. I was lying there, on the floor, handcuffed, while people watched, judging me." Edward's dad, who had been silent until then, clenched his fist in anger and raised his voice. "This can't be left like this. They'll pay for this humiliation, Edward. It's not right for you to go through this, and for no one to be held responsible." Edward looked at his dad, uncertain. "But what can I do, Dad? It seems like to them, I'm just another person who can be treated this way." His dad shook his head, determined. "No, son, you're going after justice. They can't treat anyone like that, especially an honest young man like you. I have a friend, a lawyer named Stephen. I'll call him right now and ask him to come here and see what we can do." "You think it will make a difference, Dad?" Edward asked, still reluctant. "I know it will, Edward. Stephen is a great lawyer and he knows how to fight for justice. I'll call him right now." Edward's dad stood up, picked up the phone, and dialed his friend's number. A few seconds later, Stephen answered. "Hello, Stephen. It's Jeffrey. How are you?" "Jeffrey, long time no talk, my friend. I'm doing well. And you?" Stephen replied in a friendly tone. Jeffrey took a deep breath, adjusting his tone. "Stephen, I need your help. Something very serious happened with my son. He was wrongly accused and humiliated by employees at a store, and the police treated him violently without any proof. Could you come to my house so we can talk about this?" On the other end of the line, Stephen was silent for a moment before responding seriously. "Of course, Jeffrey. This is unacceptable. I'll come over in a few hours. Don't worry, we'll handle this the best way possible." Jeffrey thanked him and hung up, turning to Edward. "Stephen is on his way, son. He'll help you fight for justice." A few hours later, Stephen arrived at Edward's house. He was a tall man with a serious demeanor, carefully styled white hair and wearing a sharp, dark suit. Edward and his parents greeted him and invited him to sit in the living room. "So, Edward, tell me everything that happened in the smallest details," Stephen asked with a compassionate and attentive look. Edward started telling the story again, explaining every moment from his arrival at the store, the encounter with the attendants, the unfair treatment he received, and the humiliation of the police approach. Stephen listened attentively, asking questions to clarify specific points and taking notes. When Edward finished, Stephen shook his head, visibly outraged. "What they did to you, Edward, is a crime. You have every right to sue both the store and the police. They both acted negligently and abusively. This situation needs to be taken seriously, and we will make them answer for it in court." "Do you think we have a chance?" Edward asked, hopeful. Yes, and I'll go even further, Stephen replied. I know a journalist named Jerry who works for an important local newspaper. I'll pass you his contact. Having the media on our side can be crucial to bring public attention to this injustice. Stephen handed Edward a business card with the journalist's number. They discussed the next steps for the case, and after a few more details, the lawyer left, promising to start the process as soon as possible. After Stephen left, Edward grabbed his dad's phone and called Jerry, the journalist. He briefly explained the situation, and Jerry seemed genuinely interested. Edward, this is an important story and the public needs to know about it. Here's what we'll do. Let's meet at a cafe near your house so I can understand all the details. That way, I can write a full article. A few minutes later, Edward arrived at the cafe, where Jerry was already waiting. They greeted each other, and Edward began telling the story again, detailing every moment, while the journalist typed away on his notebook. At the end, Jerry looked at Edward seriously. This is going to blow up in the city, Edward. Stories like yours need to be told. Now I need to take some pictures of you for the article. Is that okay? Edward hesitated a little, uncomfortable with the idea of exposing his image, but he eventually agreed. Jerry took some pictures of him and promised that the article would appear in the newspaper the next day. They said goodbye, and Edward returned home, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. The next morning, Geoffrey woke Edward up with enthusiasm. "Son, look at this," he said, holding up the newspaper. The article about Edward's story was displayed on an entire page, accompanied by the photos Jerry had taken. Edward took the newspaper and read the report carefully. The story was told in detail, and he felt a wave of emotions as he saw his experience shared with the whole city. That afternoon, Stephen returned to Edward's house to inform him that the lawsuit against the store and the police had begun. He explained that the trial would take place in a few months, and with the media's support and the community behind them, they had a good chance of winning. Days later, Edward's story continued to gain traction, and the pressure on the phone store grew every day. With extensive media coverage and support on social media, the store was finally forced to make a public statement. In the statement, the store's representative deeply regretted the incident and admitted that the attendant had acted hastily and unfairly by accusing Edward of theft without any proof. Despite the public apology, Edward still felt the weight of the humiliation and knew that the trial would be an essential step for justice to be fully served. A few days before the trial, Edward still hadn't received the confirmed date, which made him anxious. One afternoon, Stephen came over and explained, with a serious but reassuring expression, that the hearing had been scheduled. "Edward, the trial is set for next Monday, at 9 in the morning, Stephen said, looking at him firmly. "I want you to be prepared, so let's talk a little about what will happen." Edward nodded, attentive. "Of course, Stephen. I want to do everything right." Stephen smiled, placing a hand on Edward's shoulder. "Well, on the day of the trial, you'll be called to tell your version of the facts. I want you to be honest and stay calm. Tell exactly what happened without omitting anything, but don't let your emotions take over. The most important thing is for the judge to see that you're confident about what you lived through." "I understand. I'm still nervous, but I'll do my best to control it," Edward replied. "That's normal, but I'll be there with you the whole time. We'll show that you were a victim of prejudiced and violent treatment. And remember, we have the evidence, the security footage, the media's testimony, and public support. This is a cause that deserves to be heard," Stephen explained in a reassuring tone. When the day of the trial finally arrived, Edward woke up early and tried to stay calm. He dressed simply but elegantly, and as he looked in the mirror, he took a deep breath, trying to shake off his nervousness. His parents were ready to accompany him and hugged him before they left the house. Upon arriving at the courthouse, he noticed the presence of several journalists, along with curious onlookers waiting to see the outcome of the case. Upon entering the courtroom, he found Stephen, who stood up and greeted him with a firm handshake. "Remember what we talked about. I'm with you every step of the way," Stephen said with a confident look. Minutes later, the judge entered, and everyone stood in respect. After a brief moment, the judge began the trial, calling both the prosecution and defense to present their versions. The store's lawyer spoke first, trying to downplay the events and claiming that the attendant acted on legitimate suspicions, but that the intention was never to harm Edward. He argued that the mistake was unfortunate, but suggested that the store had already issued a public apology, and the incident should be viewed as a misunderstanding. When it was Stephen's turn to speak, he stood up with a serious expression. "Your Honor, we are here because my client, Mr. Edward Santos, suffered public humiliation and an act of violence based on a hasty and prejudiced judgment. This situation is not a simple misunderstanding. Mr. Edward was treated like a criminal, handcuffed and humiliated in front of everyone, with no proof of guilt. We have the security footage that clearly shows he was not involved in any theft." The judge nodded and then asked Edward to take the stand to give his testimony. Edward took a deep breath and walked to the podium, giving a brief glance at Stephen before he began speaking. "Mr. Edward, please tell us what happened that day," the judge said respectfully. "Well, Your Honor, I went to the city center to get a battery for my phone, which had stopped working," Edward began, his voice steady. He recounted every detail from his arrival at the store, the moment he was approached by the attendant, to the moment he was handcuffed and humiliated in front of everyone. The people in the room listened attentively, some visibly moved by Edward's situation. After finishing his testimony, he returned to sit next to Stephen, who placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The judge then asked for the security footage to be shown, which clearly demonstrated the real suspect running through the store, wearing similar clothes but with different details, while Edward was in another part of the store with no involvement in the incident. The defense lawyers for the store and the police tried to justify their actions, but their arguments were quickly dismantled by the evidence analysis and Edward's powerful testimony. After a few hours of deliberation and additional testimonies, the judge finally prepared to give the verdict. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as he spoke. After reviewing all the evidence and hearing the testimonies, the court finds that Mr. Edward Santos was wrongfully accused and treated abusively by both the store's staff and the police. The court orders the store to pay a significant compensation to Mr. Edward for the moral and psychological damages caused, and the officers involved will be suspended for misconduct. Upon hearing the judge's words, Edward felt an indescribable relief. His parents embraced him, emotional, and Stephen smiled, satisfied with the outcome. Edward, though still shaken, knew he had achieved something important, not just for himself, but for his community. On the way out of the courthouse, a few journalists were waiting for him, and with Stephen's support he gave a brief statement. "This experience was painful and humiliating, but today I see that fighting for justice was worth it. I hope no one else has to go through what I went through. We just want respect and dignity." Edward returned home with the feeling that, despite everything, his struggle had a greater purpose. He knew the incident wouldn't be easily forgotten, but also that his courage would help raise awareness about the importance of fighting against prejudice and abuse. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.